All right, welcome everybody. If I might have your attention, please. Feel free to go on eating. If you need to get up and get food or anything else, Austin knows that people are going to be getting up and down during the course of the presentations, so that's no problem. I know there are a few more groups of people that are going to come in and join us in a few minutes. But I want to welcome everybody here this morning to West End United Methodist Church. Not only do we have a room full of people from West End, but then we also have Methodist friends and friends from different faith communities throughout our region. So we've got friends from Columbia and friends from Murfreesboro and some other parts of Tennessee. So take a chance to meet some new people today, especially when we're on break between the two sessions. I'm not going to talk too much longer. I want to give the full time that we have to Austin. But I will just say that I just met Austin today. But I read Austin's book, Transforming, in the spring. And it was around the same time that the United Methodist Church was starting to really come to blows over all things sexuality. And as I was reading Austin's book, I said, this is somebody that needs to come and help us think about our moment in time. And so I reached out to Austin. I said, I know this is pretty short notice for a speaker, but could you come as early as this fall? And he said, yes. So I am pleased to have Austin Harkey here. He's an Old Testament scholar, a writer, a speaker, a trainer, and I will let him tell you all about himself. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Austin Harkey up here.
All right, can you hear me okay? Good? All right. Thank you so much for coming this morning. I always, a friend of mine always says, be aware that people could be napping when they're coming to see you, so be thankful that they're not napping and they're here. So I appreciate your being here and not napping, especially on a Sunday afternoon when it's this hot out. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I got a little bit of a background there. My name is Austin. My background, long story short, my faith background is I grew up in non-denominational evangelical churches, so that was the faith that I sort of came up in until I was about 10. Then I moved over, my family moved over to the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. If you're familiar with them, they're sort of the more conservative arm of the Lutheran Church. And then as a sort of late teenager, young adult, moved into the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which is sort of the more progressive Lutheran arm. And so my background is kind of now I'm coming from a more Lutheran perspective in a lot of the stuff that I do, but because I work with churches from so many different backgrounds, I get to sort of take in some great stuff from John Wesley and from like all these other big theologians in the past that are connected with different church denominations. So hopefully we can talk about biblical interpretation without me being like, and Luther said. So that's my background theologically. I graduated from Luther Seminary in 2014 with a degree in biblical studies, specializing in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And I specifically went into, well, actually, I didn't go in to learn about the Old Testament. That happened by accident. I went in as a youth and family ministry person, and then found out all I wanted to do was sit around and read Hebrew, which was not necessarily compatible with teaching teenagers. They weren't as interested in it as I was. But my interest in the Old Testament came from my own experiences as somebody who came out as bisexual as a teenager. As a teenager, I came out as bi, and the faith traditions that I had been in, the Evangelical Covenant Church and then the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, were not super happy about that idea. And a lot of what was used sort of to talk about how wrong LGBT people were came from bits of what we think of as the Old Testament. And so I was like, well, there's got to be more to it than this. That was sort of my interest and my coming into it. I went to seminary because I thought I would like to learn more about religion, I would like to learn more about faith, and growing up in traditions that said, well, there's one right way to interpret and there's one right way to believe, I went to seminary thinking, well, they will have all the answers about all the one right ways. If you've ever been to seminary, they do not have all the answers. That's not how that works. They teach you how to ask better questions, which is the point of education in general, I think. And so what we're going to be doing today is we look at biblical texts. This morning we're going to start with a bit on the biblical texts around gender and orientation, and then we are going to take a break, and then we are going to talk more about allyship in the church and what that looks like. So as we look at these biblical passages, I am not here to tell you, here's the one right way to interpret these passages, because I don't think that really exists. My hope is that I can give you a little bit of background, a little bit of information about the texts, and then I'm going to ask us some questions to ponder about the text. So this is not me going, here's what this text says. This is hopefully us coming together to ask good questions about the text instead. And I'll try to move around a little bit here so that I'm not blocking the pillars too much, or the pillars aren't blocking me, either way. So let's talk about diverse sexualities and gender identities in the Bible. Before we do that, I want to just give us the briefest background on gender and orientation or sexuality, because it's going to help us understand what we're looking at in these passages. I'm going to go through 2 slides here with some background on this, and if you're a little bit like fuzzy on it by the end of these 2 slides, that's okay, because we're going to go on it way more in depth in the second half of this session. So let's talk about sexuality or orientation. Here's our little stick figure person. And their orientation or their sexuality is something that is internal to them, and it's about who the gender of the people that they are attracted to, right? So your orientation, we've kind of got a general understanding of this when people say that they're gay or lesbian or bisexual. That's about their orientation or their sexuality. I'm going to use those 2 words sort of synonymously. The thing is, nobody can tell by looking at you what your sexuality or your orientation is. We can make guesses based on stereotypes, but you can't really tell what somebody's sexual orientation is by looking at them. Looking at this person here, we would not really know what their orientation would be, right? They're just a little stick figure. We can't see inside of them. But the minute you put somebody next to them, you make a guess about what their orientation is, right, based on the person that they are around. So your orientation is something that is internal to you. It's who you're attracted to. Your behavior is how that is made visible to other people through specific personal actions or through social systems like marriage. So here we've got your orientation and your behavior, and that's kind of what we can see, right? Now, we would make specific guesses or assumptions about these 2 stick figures here. Like, for instance, we might say, well, this is probably a straight couple or a heterosexual couple, right? But that might not necessarily be true. For instance, one of these people could be bisexual, and the fact that they're in a relationship with somebody of a different gender doesn't mean they're not bisexual, right? So we might make assumptions based on what we see here, and we have to be aware of the fact that we might be making those assumptions. So there's sexuality and orientation in like a very, very small nutshell. Different from sexuality and orientation is the concept of gender. Your gender is about your own experience of gender regardless of your relationship with other people. So the way that we split up or understand gender is through 3 different facets, and they're all interconnected. They all have to do with each other and relate to each other in different ways. So the 3 facets of gender that we talk about are your body, your gender identity, and your gender expression. So your body, sometimes we call this your assigned sex. Your body is essentially, when you're born, the doctor takes one look at what's between your legs and decides this is a boy or this is a girl. That is your assigned sex, okay? The problem is that that one piece of our anatomy is not all that has to do with our what we would think of as assigned sex. For instance, you have internal reproductive organs, you have hormone levels, you have your genetic coding. There's a lot of things that you can't see in that one glance, but that all kind of, all of your body and all those gendered parts of your body are sort of one aspect of gender. The other aspect of gender here that we have in the second one is your gender identity. That's how you perceive your own sense of gender. So that is internal to you. It's not something that people can see, kind of like orientation or sexuality isn't something that people can see. What people do see is the third thing, your gender expression. The way that you dress, the way you do your hair, the way you move, the way you talk, all of those things are parts of your gender expression. So these are kind of the 3 parts of gender here. I've got body pointing to the one part of our bodies that people mostly care about when they talk about assigned sex. Your identity has to do with your brain, how your brain forms, how your brain works. But of course, your brain is part of your body, right? Which is affected by your hormones and your genetic codes and all these other things. So all of these things are sort of interrelated. The last bit there, your expression. For instance, this person is wearing a dress and has a little bow in their hair. That's part of their gender expression. So I just wanted to pull out that difference between sexuality or orientation and gender as two separate things as we're getting into these biblical texts. And we'll go more in depth in that in the second session. As we talk about orientation and gender in the ancient world, though, we have to be aware that the way that we understand these things today is very different from how they used to understand these things, right? So in the ancient Near East, in the Roman Empire, in the Jewish world of ancient Greece, the thing is you didn't necessarily have an identity like you would say somebody has an identity as a gay person or as a trans person. Rather, you were sort of people were sort of judged on the things that they did, so things that were visual or physical expressions. So really when we're looking in the ancient world, we're not looking at things like sexual orientation or gender identity, because those are internal to you that can't be seen. Really what we're thinking about and looking at is your sexual behavior and your gender expression, the things that are seen. So that's really more what we're looking at in the ancient world. So we don't want to assume things about people's identities. We're just looking at the external things that we can look at and read about. The other thing that's confusing about this is that gender expression and orientation can get confused sometimes. For instance, if you see somebody walking down the street and you look at them and you read them as like a male or masculine person, but maybe their sort of way that they move is a little bit more feminine, we might make assumptions about that person's sexuality or sexual orientation and say, well, that guy's gay. But we don't know anything about who he's attracted to. We just see that his mannerisms, we read them as more feminine, right? So we're confusing gender expression and orientation in that moment, even though they're two separate things. Does that make sense? Cool. So within the biblical sort of scope of things, people back then did the same thing, where we would make different, there would be some confusion about gender expression versus the sexual behavior that you might want to engage in. There's a little bit of confusion there. So what we're actually looking at when we're looking at the biblical text is we're comparing experiences. We're comparing what the Bible says about visual things like sexual behavior and visual things like gender expression, and then we're looking at how people that do things that are sort of outside the norm are treated and what that looks like. So that's really what we're looking at here. So let's get into it. Let's take a look first at some passages around sexual orientation and behavior so that we can kind of understand. And when I say what we're going to be starting out with here are what is generally called the clobber passages. They're generally called clobber passages used against LGBT folks. So we're going to look at the ones around sexual behavior first and try to understand more about what's going on in these particular passages. The first passage here is Genesis 2. It's part of our creation story. There's two creation stories in Genesis, one in Genesis 1, one in Genesis 2. This is the Genesis 2 creation story. This is where God creates one human person, and then we get this moment here where the Lord God says, it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. Now, this is the NRSV version we're reading from here. And the interesting thing about the first human created in Genesis 2 is that the first person doesn't actually have a gender right at the beginning. It's just Adam, right? Adamah is the Hebrew. Adam is just a being made of earth, right? An earth human. The first person doesn't have a gender right at the beginning. So when you read this and you say, it's not good that the man should be alone, it's really more like it's not good that this human person should be alone, right? So what happens here is God creates all of these different animals and brings them to Adam, the first person, and says, you into any of these? And Adam's like, no, not really, which is good news for us. So Adam kind of says, this is not my bag, I'm not into this. And God says, okay, well, let's do this. And so God creates the second human being from Adam's side, right? Adam falls asleep. God separates part of Adam's side, or we read rib sometimes, and creates the second person. And Adam sees this second person and says, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. And this is the first time that we actually have that split in gender. First there's no gender, and then suddenly we have this split in gender where there's man and there's woman, right? So as we read this passage today, some people will look at this and they'll kind of go, this is the Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve argument, right? Like God intentionally creates two different gendered people and puts them together and says, now you're a couple, right? The other interesting thing about Genesis 2 is we sometimes make an argument about marriage based on Genesis 2, but nobody really gets married in Genesis 2. That's not really a thing that happens. They're just suddenly together, and there you go. But the problem here is that we've got a couple of questions that complicate this text. The first question that complicates the text is, what is the problem that God is solving by creating Eve? Is the problem that there's only one gender and two genders are the best thing, and that's what we need? Or is the problem that the earth creature is lonely? It's not good that this earth creature should be alone, right? So if that's the first problem that God is trying to solve, the creation of gender complementarity is not necessarily the solution. The solution is having another person, right? Is it necessarily for this other person to be of a different gender than Adam? This is kind of the argument that some folks make around gender complementarity, where they say, well, you have to have the two things, right? You have to have the two things that go together like little puzzle pieces, right? But you would think that if difference was what Adam needed, if difference was the point that God was trying to make, like two different things need to come together, then Adam would have picked one of the animals, right? Who was different from him, right? Adam could have been like this penguin. Perfect. I love this, right? It's totally different from me. But what we actually get when we're reading this text is Adam recognizing the sameness of these two people. Adam says, this at last as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This person is like me. So when we have this moment here where the original problem is loneliness and we get this solution in having another person there, it's not necessarily the difference between sexes or between genders that is required here. What's recognized is the sameness between the two earth creatures, right? It's the sameness that is emphasized and not the difference. So that just kind of complicates this sort of sense of what's going on in this passage, helping us turn from, yes, God needed two separate things to come together like puzzle pieces, and kind of makes us rethink what we're thinking about this passage. The last question that we have to ask around this passage is, are human beings called to recreate Eden? Are we called back into, like if we were going to understand this passage as requiring all relationships to have one man and one woman, are we called to try to recreate this, or are we called forward as Christians into something new? If we're called backward to recreate Eden, then maybe we have to have more questions about how to be more like these first two people. But if this is just the beginning of a story that continues on through the rest of the Bible and into modern history, then maybe we're not called to recreate this particular paradigm. So these are just some questions to bring forward as we read this text. James Brownson is somebody who I've found really helpful, and his book should be on your resource list there. He wrote a book called Bible, Gender, Sexuality. And he talks a lot about how we understand gender in this particular Genesis passage that I found really helpful. But the thing that he points to here is that the primary movement in the text is not from unity to differentiation, but from the isolation of an individual to the deep blessing of shared kinship and community. And I think that really kind of sums up what's going on in Genesis 2 in a really helpful way. So I would definitely recommend his book if you want to read more about this passage. So, what's the next passage in the Bible we think about when we think of clobber passages? It might be this one. This is Genesis chapter 19, right? This is the whole reason we have the word sodomite is because of this passage. This is an interesting passage because, well, for a lot of reasons. What's going on in this passage? In this passage, Abraham's relative Lot has moved to this city called Sodom, and some angels who have recently visited Abraham are going to visit Lot in this town, right? So these angels or visitors, it's always a little bit like, who are these people? We kind of usually read them as angels. They've come to visit Lot, and they're going to stay in Lot's house that night. The angels originally say, well, we're going to go stay in the town square, which was something that people sometimes did. If they didn't have a place to stay, they would stay in the town square. And Lot's like, no, don't stay in the town square. Come and stay at my house. So that's where we get into this passage. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the peoples to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg of you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. So, we're already a little bit like, Lot, what are you doing, right? This is a really complex story, and for a period of human history, we read this and went, oh, this is about sexual behavior between men and how that's bad. The period of history in which we have thought that is actually very small. It was something that didn't really happen until the mid-1800s was when that we were first like, that's what this story is about. Before that, that wasn't a common interpretation of this passage. We've got some questions about this passage, right? The argument is that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of this attempted same-gender sexual behavior, right? But there's so much more going on in this passage than just the gender of the angels and the gender of the people in the village. There's so much more going on there. For instance, you've essentially got attempted gang rape or sexual violence, right? So that is a huge thing that is going on here, right? You've also got what's complicated in the hospitality codes of the time, which basically said if you were a man and you had people come stay in your house, if anything happened to those people, you lost all standing in your community. Because as a man, you were supposed to be the big, strong protector that made sure nothing happened to the people in your house. So you lost your status in that community. You essentially, your name was dirt in that town if anything happened to the people that you, and especially the men that were in your house, which is why Lot's like, well, no, don't hurt these guys. Here's my daughters instead, right? Which today we look at and we're like, what the heck is going on, right? Why would he do that? So that's what's going on here is we've got these household codes, right? So there's a lot more going on in this text than just the gender of the people involved. So how do we understand this text? Well, one way we might think about this text or understanding this text is by looking at how other people within the biblical canon, within the Bible, understood this story. And it turns out that there's actually another reference to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the book of Ezekiel. So what does Ezekiel say happens in Sodom and Gomorrah? Ezekiel says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, access to food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." Now, this is interesting because, one, Ezekiel doesn't specifically mention anything around sexuality or sexual behavior, which they could have. They could have said Sodom was destroyed because they didn't follow God's law about X, right? And we'll talk about those law passages in a minute, but that's not what Ezekiel says. Ezekiel, before, even if you want to read the sexual behavior things into the abominable things category there are all these other things that happen first that are considered to be more important. They had pride, excess of food, prosper at ease, but did not aid the poor and needy, right? The other thing that we might look at are the ways that Sodom and Gomorrah were understood in extra-biblical sources. So other writings from around the same time or in the same context. And we have some Jewish sources that talk about how Sodom was known to be the most inhospitable and dangerous city around. So the idea here was you knew what you were getting into if you went to Sodom. It'd be like walking into a dark alley knowing people are going to jump you. That was the general feeling about the city of Sodom. So we might ask some questions about how we understand this passage. Is this specifically about the gender of the people involved, or is this about sexual violence sort of writ large and what we need to say about sexual violence? Matthew Vines wrote a great book about these passages called God and the Gay Christian, another one I'd highly recommend if you want to know more about these passages. But he kind of sums all this up for us. The problems that we kind of have with the text, what was going on, maybe it was more around sexual violence, right? And about honor in terms of what honor and the hospitality codes around that time would have said. So he sums this up for us pretty well. So let's talk about the law that I was just mentioning there. What does Leviticus say, right? These are two passages from Leviticus that are often brought up, 18:22 and 20:13, and we read those and we go, that seems pretty cut and dried, right? It doesn't seem like there could be a lot going on here. But the problem, of course, is as Christians, we are always making decisions about which parts of the Mosaic law we are going to follow, right? We are always making decisions about that. And so some people will kind of write this off and be like, well, we don't follow any of the laws around kosher foods, right? A friend of mine constantly talks about how polyester fabric is an abomination according to the law, right? We make specific decisions about what parts of the law we are going to follow as Christians. So what I would push us to do is instead of kind of saying, oh, the Mosaic law is, trash, throw it out, we don't need it, like the first, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and some parts of Numbers, like those are where we see the law, right? And some people will kind of say, well, that's not relevant to us anyway, just toss it out. A caution there that I would give us, especially as somebody who studies the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, is when we kind of treat these first books of the Bible with the law in them as if they're trash anyways, we can accidentally veer into anti-Semitism because our Jewish siblings do think these parts of the law are very important and do follow them. So we want to be very careful about how we treat these parts of the Bible. They're not just sort of like there to be tossed away. But we do have to have a Christian understanding and ethic about how we make decisions and say this bit, like, we get the 10 Commandments, right? Everybody's kind of like, well, the 10 Commandments still stand. They're still important for us, right? Do not murder, for instance. A great law that we all want to keep. So that's one that we're going to keep, right? Maybe the one about not planting 2 types of seed in a field is not one we're going to keep. But why? How do we make that decision between what we do keep and what we don't? I would push us to try to find reasons behind this, because if we just say, well, that one no and this one yes, then we kind of get into this situation where people are like, well, Christians don't actually practice what they preach. They don't actually walk the talk, right? So how do we decide which parts of the Bible we're going to keep and which parts we're not? One lens that I have found to be helpful, everybody's going to have a different lens on this, but one lens that I have found to be helpful is the greatest commandment. This is the version in Matthew, but you can read it in a bunch of the different Gospels. When Jesus is asked in Matthew what the greatest commandment is, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's in Deuteronomy, by the way, and I think also in Leviticus. He says, this is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So when Jesus says, you can take all of the law and sum it up in love God and love your neighbor, that gives us a lens for how to interpret the rest of the law. Does this particular verse, whatever it is, help us love God and love our neighbor, or does it hurt our neighbor? The part with helping us love God can be a little bit iffy, but at least we can say, does this hurt our neighbor or help our neighbor, right? So this is one lens to help us understand which law text to pay attention to. So if we're looking at the Levitical text and going, do these verses help us love our neighbor or not? And then we look, and we're going to talk about this later, we look at the epidemic of suicide around LGBT youth who are taught with those texts that they are wrong and bad. That's not loving our neighbor, right? Therefore, we have to figure out something else to do with those verses and something else to do with those texts. So you may have a different lens through which you look at the law to try to decide these things, but this has been a lens that's been helpful for me, so I wanted to share that with you. But I think it's important for us to have lenses that can help us decide things so that we're not just going, yeah, toss the whole thing out. So let's talk about Romans. Romans is in the New Testament. We've got this really nice version here from Paul where he says, for this reason, and now we should stop here for a second. What reason? When Paul says, for this reason, he's talking about idolatry. He's talking about a people who gave up worshiping God and decided to worship other gods or idols instead. So that's what this reason is. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. So we read this and we immediately go, okay, same-sex sexual behavior is unnatural and dangerous, right? That's what we're getting out of this passage. But then we have all these questions that we have to ask because it's not that simple. The first question we have to ask is, what does Paul mean by degrading and unnatural? Turns out, Paul calls a lot of things unnatural because unnatural in his context meant something different. When we say unnatural, we mean like it doesn't exist in the natural world or it's like a weird deviation from something we would normally see in nature. When Paul says unnatural, the word that he uses actually means it's not what we do, like it's not our cultural norm. That's what his version of unnatural means. So when he says that these things are unnatural, he doesn't mean it doesn't happen in nature. He means that's just not how we do things here. That's what Paul's talking about there. For instance, we've got this verse in 1 Corinthians where Paul says, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is degrading to him? Degrading is another word that is used around honor codes of the time. So in Paul's particular context, he would say, yes, a man with long hair is degrading, and he also in some places calls it unnatural, but that doesn't mean it doesn't mean the same thing that we think degrading and unnatural means. It means within the Greek and Roman social code of the time, you lost honor, and honor was something that was as important as money in terms of your social interactions with people. So because we are no longer in that kind of situation, the whole degrading, unnatural thing means something different to us than it did to them, and that complicates this passage. And then the last point here that I want to talk about for a second is how much of this passage has to do with warnings against lust and excess in general. One of the helpful interpreters of this passage is David Gushee, who's a Christian theologian, and he talks about how this passage may actually be more about excess in the context of essentially a Stoic worldview. If you know anything about Stoicism in the ancient Greek world, essentially the idea was don't get too excited about anything. Any sort of excess of emotion was seen as a moral failing, whether that emotion was too much happiness or too much sadness or too much of anything was seen as a moral failing. It looked like you didn't have any self-control, right? Paul is writing within that context where you're supposed to have self-control, you're supposed to be buttoned down, you're supposed to have your honor intact, and any sort of example of somebody showing too much emotion of any kind was degrading to them, right? In the way that we would understand the word degrading. It hurt their honor, it hurt their public standing. So when Paul is talking about degrading passions and consumed with passion, that is in sort of opposition to the Stoic idea about how you need to be buttoned up all the time, right? So part of what's going on is not necessarily that the sexual behavior is bad because of the gender of the people they're with. It's that degrading passion in general is bad. So that's part of what's going on here. So David Gushee looks at this passage and he says, the other thing that we have to keep in mind here is that excess of sexual pleasure in this time also usually meant that you were having relationships with people outside of your marriage or your primary relationship. And that looked like a lot of different things. It could look like pederasty and prostitution, which were part of the ancient Greek world, where you would have somebody who essentially is a legal adult having a relationship with somebody who is essentially a child, and that's not good. There's a power dynamic there that is at play. And so there are so many more things that complicate this passage. It's not just Paul saying same gender sexual acts are bad. It's Paul saying something about this whole situation is bad. It could be the gender of the people involved. It could be the power dynamics between the people involved. It could be the honor and shame system that we're in. It could be the Stoic system that we're in. So all of these things are wrapped up and relevant to what Paul is talking about. It's not as simple as saying gay stuff bad. And that's really the point that I want to get across, is that there's more going on here. The last sort of clobber passage verse related to sexuality that we're going to look at are vice lists, which are in both 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. Vice lists were something that were super common in letters of the time between people that were seen as role models for whatever it is, whether you're like a role model in the Senate or you're a theologian or you're a philosopher or whatever. People would write letters to you and say like, how should I live my life? And then you would write back and you would say, do all these things are good, and those are virtue lists. And then a whole list that says do all these, or don't do all these things, these are bad, and that's your vice list. So it was essentially like, here's advice for living, right? And that's kind of what we get in these two places in the Bible, is we get two vice lists where Paul is writing to communities and saying, don't do all this stuff, it's bad. So within those vice lists, we get these two words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, which are Greek words, and they're complicated. Malakoi essentially means soft, but that it's a word that is not just, it's a word that's used in relative to clothing a lot of time. Clothing is considered soft, right? Or malakos or malakoi. So when we apply the word soft to a human, and Paul's using it for men specifically, what does it mean to be a soft man? Well, we've talked a little bit about how you're supposed to be like strong and tough and whatever, and we still have those ideas about men today, right? To be called a soft man in this context was seen as bad. One thing that is actually interesting to just sort of insert into our Western understandings of this text is within Eastern philosophy from China and other parts of Southeast Asia, to be a soft man, both in history and today, is seen as a good thing. It means that you are in relation to other people and you notice their needs and you respond to their needs. So when we think about things like this, we also have to think about not just the differences between the culture of ancient Rome and our culture today right here, but also ancient Rome and how these things might be read by Christians in China, right? They would read soft man and they would go like, great, why is Paul so upset by this, right? So we also have to think about how that works in this context. Arsena koitai is a word that doesn't show up anywhere else in the Bible, and actually doesn't show up very much at all in any ancient sources, and we think Paul might have made it up. He combined the word male and bed and smashed them together and assumed everybody would know what that means. Because we don't have a lot of other context, we really don't know what it means. But that's the word that has, in some Bible translations starting in the late 1800s, been translated as homosexual, even though that was not a word then. Sexual orientation as an understanding didn't exist back then. So that's why this is complicated, is we're taking our modern understandings and imposing them onto Scripture in ways that can be harmful. So we have to be very careful about that. The last thing that we have to keep aware of is this idea that within Paul's time, there was no such thing as a relationship between two people of the same gender who were equals in social status, in age. That just didn't really exist because things like marriage existed kind of like we think of it in the Middle Ages. It was for the sake of property and power. It was not for the sake of two people getting married because they loved each other. And so within Paul's context, there was really no equivalent for what we would think of as a modern same-gender relationship. So we also have to keep that in mind here. So now we've gotten all done with those sexuality clobber passages, I want to talk about some positive representations and what those might look like for us. The most obvious positive representation around sexuality in the Bible for same-gender folks are David and Jonathan, and they're so cute, you guys. I love reading about them. David and Jonathan, David, of course, King David, you know of King David, I hope. Jonathan was the son of King Saul, right? So David took over after Saul, and it was a very rocky transition of power. But essentially, David gets to have this beautiful I fell in love with a prince story, which is really nice. What happens is that these two people apparently kind of fall in love. They have this moment where they sort of pledge their fealty to each other. We've got this moment where it says, the soul of Jonathan was bound up to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Actually, there's a verse 4, which for some reason I didn't put up here. The next verse after the ending there, Jonathan takes off his cloak and gives it to David and wraps David in his cloak. And that physical movement of wrapping the other person in your cloak was part of marriage ceremonies at the time. It meant something. So this idea that we've got this relationship between two people of the same gender and that there's no negative consequences, there's nothing negative said about them, what happens eventually is that Saul and Jonathan are killed together in battle. And in 2 Samuel 1, David writes this lament for both Saul and Jonathan. And he says, I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. And if you can read that and be like, oh, he was straight, I have questions for you. So David and Jonathan are probably the most classic version of this sort of same-gender love story in the Bible. The next text to look at for a minute is the story of Ruth and Naomi. And now this one is one that we've got questions about, and I would not go as far as to say these two people were for sure in a relationship. But what we do recognize is that what Ruth says to Naomi, where she says, I will follow you, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, I will die where you die, and we will be buried together. The poetry that Ruth gives in that moment to tell Naomi that she's going with her is so romantic in nature that we read it at weddings today. Like, we recognize that confession of love is real, and whether it's romantic love, we can't say for sure, but that confession, there's something about it that we recognize as a really loving act. The other part of this story that people always point to and look at is where Naomi is kind of telling her two daughters-in-law they should go home, and Orpah leaves, but Ruth clings to her. And that use of clinging language is the exact same language that we get in Genesis 1, where Adam and Eve are sort of brought together, that clinging language. So people look at that and they go, seems like something's going on here. My favorite interpretation of this is that Ruth was bisexual and that she was married to a guy for a while and then fell in love with Naomi and then eventually marries Boaz, right? Like, there's a lot of different ways that we can understand this text, but it's one that is worth looking at, not because we can say anything definitive, but because we seem to recognize that there's something going on here between these two women, and it might be worth taking a closer look at. Another text to look at is in Matthew 8, the story of the centurion's servant. This is a story where Jesus is out healing people, and this Roman centurion comes to him and says, "Please heal my servant," right? And Jesus is like, "Absolutely, I'm on my way." And the centurion's like, no, wait a minute, don't come to my house. Don't do that. And it's a really interesting story for sort of queer theology and queer interpretation, and we'll talk about that word. I know that word sometimes makes people go, ugh, so we'll talk about that. But it's an interesting story because the word that is used here for servant, pais, is used in extra-biblical, outside of the Bible sources as a word for somebody's same-gender lover who is younger than them. So we've got a weird power dynamic here to recognize immediately. Like, if this was a relationship between two people of the same gender, it probably, like I said, was not people who were like two consenting, like, equal adults. One was younger than the other, and one was clearly in like a servant role. So we do have to recognize that right up front. However, it's interesting to note that when Jesus responds to this person, including that sort of social context of using the word pais, Jesus doesn't respond negatively. Jesus is like, absolutely, I will come and heal them, and I will come to your house. And we know how Jesus liked to go to the houses of people that he shouldn't have gone to their house of. Like, right, he did that all the time. He went and had dinner with people all the time that he shouldn't have. The reason that, one of the reasons that it's an interesting text for a queer interpretation is because of the centurion's response, right? So the centurion says, you don't have to come to my house. I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. Say the word, and I know that you can do it, right? And we kind of focus on that bit, the centurion's response about, like, I believe that it's possible for you to heal without even having gone there. And we sort of focus on that and go, oh, wow, his faith. Because that's what Jesus does. Jesus says, this person has more faith than anybody that I've met yet, right? But what's interesting from a queer perspective is, if we are reading this as if the centurion has their partner at home, this moment of saying, I am not worthy, and don't, like, it's like this distancing yourself from a power that you are afraid is going to reject you, right? And that is something that queer folks, LGBTQ plus folks read and go, oh, I know how that feels. Like, yes, I want to be in a relationship with God, but also don't come over here because I'm still scared of you a little bit, like, for good reason, right? And so that moment of, like, wanting to come close and also being like, but not too close, is something that is really interesting to get into with LGBTQ plus folks, because we all kind of go, oh yeah, I know how that feels. So it's a great one for getting into conversation. So that's where we're going to stop with sexuality and orientation. We're going to move now into the passages around gender. And so, again, making this sort of difference between orientation as the people that you are attracted to and the sexual behavior around that, over to gender and your understanding of who you are as a man, a woman, somebody totally different, somebody outside the gender binary. What does that look like in a biblical context? So the first text, we're going to go back to Genesis for a minute. Genesis 1 is the first text where people go, this is where, like, the gender difference is really, really important, is in Genesis 1. This is where God is creating humankind. And remember, there's those two creation stories. So in this creation story, rather than having one person created first and then you bust them into two, in Genesis 1, the two people are created at the same time. So that's what's going on in Genesis 1. So we've got God creating all of these things, and then God says, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, every living thing that moves upon the earth. So, sometimes people will take a look at this and go, okay, God created people male and female, period, full stop. That's it. You got your two boxes, and you don't get to switch. No swapsies. It's not how that works. But here are the questions around this passage. The first one is, does this passage confirm there are only two genders? Absolutely. Well, we could have a whole argument all day about Genesis 1 and whether it's a literal creation story or not. I'm not going to do that right now. Let's put that to the side. What I do want to look at is the poetry of Genesis 1. Because what's happening here is that God is creating the entire world out of nothing. And God creates everything in this very poetic sense. And we recognize it because it's like the same thing repeated over and over, right? God creates the day and the night and the sun and the moon, and God looks at it and it was good. And then on the second day, God separates this and this thing, and God looks at it and it is good. And then the third day, God does this thing and this thing, good, over, right? Same poetic repetition the whole way through. God's creating these binaries all the way through. Day, night, sun, moon, land, sea. All of these things are being split into binaries to categorize the world. So when we've got all of these things being split into these binaries where God is categorizing the world, it shouldn't surprise us that when we get to human beings, God's like, ah, yes, and there was this thing, and it was good, right? We're doing the same splitting into two that God does with the entire world. However, that doesn't mean that in all of those categories there aren't middle spaces, right? Like when God creates the land and separates it from the sea, we read that in Genesis, and that's kind of period, full stop. But the biblical authors, and also people today, are not going to say, well, God only created the land and the sea, therefore there are no marshes, estuaries, beaches, coral reefs. Those middle spaces, right? We acknowledge that those exist. The biblical writers acknowledge that they existed. The idea here is that God is poetically creating the world. Not everything is included in Genesis 1. My favorite example of this is even recently, in recent history, people have looked at animals like the platypus and been like, well, what the heck do we do with this? How the heck do we categorize this thing? Is it a mammal? It looks like a duck. It lays eggs. It has milk. What? Like, the platypus does not exist in the world of Genesis 1, and yet God created the platypus. How do we make sense of that, right? So when we think about this idea of God creating two things, but then there being space in the middle, there's a recognition that not everything that exists in Genesis 1, because Genesis 1 is meant to give us a large-scale framework and not name everything in between. What does it mean to be made in God's image? And how do we understand this power-sharing dynamic? When God says, we will make the humans in our image, and then God says, have dominion over these things, right? When we think about image, there's lots of ways we can think about the image of God, but when we look at Genesis 1, the only thing that we know about God up until that point is that God makes stuff. That's all. Like, that's all we've got to go on. God makes stuff in Genesis 1. So when God says, let us make the humans in our image, what does that mean? It could mean God makes us to be makers. God makes stuff, we make stuff. And then God says you can have dominion over this land, over the creation, right? And then in some ways, it's over ourselves, right? There's an understanding that humans are going to be co-creators with God. If you want to read more about being co-creators with God, there's a great theologian called Terence Fretheim, and he does a lot of good stuff around being co-creators. But some folks will look at this and kind of go, okay, well, what does it mean to be a co-creator? There's a sharing of power going on here. And this first text, actually, going back to this binary model, Megan DeFranza wrote a really great book about intersex folks within Christianity, and we'll talk about what intersex means in a while. But she kind of says, like, it's clear that people are not just male and female. So, like, that's kind of the beginning of our argument there. So we'll talk about that. But when it comes to being co-creators with God, the idea here is that we recognize that as human beings, we do things to change the world in positive and negative ways, right? And when I say the world, I mean creation, people, everything. There are ways that we can change ourselves to be better. So for instance, vaccines are a controversial thing right now apparently, but like there are medical things that we do to make sure that we are healthy people, right? In that moment, we are being co-creators with God because we are creating medical things that can help people be happy and healthy people. That is a co-creatorship with God moment. So when we talk about things like trans folks who might decide to physically transition, that moment of co-creating who you are can be a powerful theological way of understanding what transition looks like. And we'll talk more about transition in a little bit, but I want us to keep that idea of co-creatorship in mind. Deuteronomy 22:5 is pretty much the only text that we look at and go, this is something that can be relevant to trans folks today, right? This is basically the only text that seems to talk specifically about stuff people do and what they shouldn't be doing. And it's along the same lines of those Levitical texts where we have to ask that question about, in Christian interpretation, is this something that's important for us or not? So I'm not going to go over that argument again, but again, thinking about how do we decide which parts of the law are relevant for us? We have to ask about this text as well. Other questions we have to ask about this text. Number one, what kind of clothing is Deuteronomy talking about? There are arguments, especially within Jewish sources, within the Talmud, that understood this text not to be about everyday clothing, but only about ritual clothing for worship and weapons of war. And if this only means weapons of war and ritual clothing, then this means some other things that we have to investigate too. But because we don't know what kind of clothing is being talked about here, that kind of throws a wrench into this. Second of all, how do we understand people outside the gender binary who want to wear things that are seen as male or female clothing? And that's a modern question about what to do with this text. But this was the reason that for a long time women couldn't wear pants, because of this verse specifically. This verse meant women couldn't wear pants for several hundred years in the Western world. So what do we do with the fact that women can wear pants now? Are pants a men's thing or a women's thing? Are we going to go back to making sure everybody wears sundresses all the time? What are we going to do with this? So a lot of the questions that we have around this particular verse are, what are we doing with it in terms of interpretation, right? How do we understand it in light of the fact that gendered clothing is different in every place in the world, and we can't take one idea of gendered clothing and put it on another country's idea of gendered clothing, because that's colonialism, and we don't like that. So interpretation is really the main question around this verse. The other question that we have to ask is, if this verse, if we are reading it at face value and saying men shouldn't wear women's clothing and women shouldn't wear men's clothing, how do we deal with situations in the Bible itself where it seems like that's happening? So one example of this is Joseph, and you probably know Joseph from having a Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph is one of the characters in Genesis who is a good guy throughout his entire life, which is really cool because most of the time in Genesis people are screwing up a lot. Joseph mostly does the right thing almost all the time, which is interesting to see. Joseph had a bunch of brothers. His dad made him this really cool garment of some kind. Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So Joseph gets this garment, and the thing is, we don't know what kind of clothing this is because we don't have other good contextual evidence around it. The Hebrew words are ketonet pasim is what this thing is called. And so we looked all through the Bible and we're like, well, where else is there a ketonet pasim? Because we don't know what this thing is. The problem is there's only one other place in the entire Bible where ketonet pasim is used, and so we're like, okay, these two things must be related, right? They must be the same kind of garment. But where's the only other place where it's used? It's specifically used to describe a princess dress. Tamar, in 2 Samuel 13, she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, a ketonet pasim, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. So why is Joseph wearing a princess dress? What's going on here? When we look at these two texts, and then of course, LGBTQ plus folks read this story and they go, yes, and his brothers beat him up a lot? Yeah, sounds right. This is a story in which there's somebody who is clothed in something that he should not be clothed in, according to, the understandings of clothing at the time. And yet, Joseph is not seen as negative because of that throughout his story. Of course, the other story that LGBTQ folks look at and kind of go, what's going on here, is the story where Joseph is a slave in Egypt, and he's a slave in the house of Potiphar, who's a kind of higher up official guy. And Potiphar's wife kind of comes on to Joseph, and Joseph is so not into it that he runs out the door. And so, like, queer folks have been looking at that and going, like, something's up with Joseph for a really long time. And actually, there's, within Jewish midrash and Jewish understanding, there has been a tendency to read Joseph as a very feminine person, and also a very, somebody who may have a different sexuality as well. And so that's been something that we've been thinking about for many, many, many years. So the last sort of arc that I want to bring us to here starts in Deuteronomy 23:1. This particular verse specifically is used to tell trans folks that they shouldn't transition, and we'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. But the idea that you shouldn't be able to change your body or not your reproductive organs specifically is kind of what this verse is going on. This is a super comfortable verse. Every time I read it, people are like, ugh. No one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. All right, cool. Questions that we have about this passage. One, what is the assembly of the Lord? There have been some interpreters that have said this is about not being able to enter the temple, specifically the temple in Jerusalem, to worship. There are other interpreters that say this actually means that you're not allowed to, if you are a Jewish person in ancient times who has been castrated, you are not allowed to marry a Jewish woman. And the idea there was that you couldn't have children. And so like it would essentially be taking a woman off the market who could be having children with someone else. So there's complicated ideas about what this assembly of the Lord thing means, right? So that's the first one. The second question we have to ask about this verse is, and this is a question that's asked specifically in Jewish communities, does this verse have top billing in importance, or are there other overriding concerns? Within the Reform and conservative Jewish traditions, there's an understanding that that it's more important to have a healthy person alive than to pay attention to this specific verse. There's sort of an overriding law about making sure that people stay alive. There's this, what's the word? I'm trying to remember the official word, but it's a rule that essentially says if somebody's life is at stake, all other rules kind of have to take a back seat. And so that has been the way that in Reform and conservative Jewish communities, they've said, you know what, it's more important for trans folks who want to transition to be alive than it is to follow this particular passage. And that's the way that they've understood this passage. So that's one more sort of lens to use. The last question we have to ask here is, how do we understand this verse in light of eunuchs, people who are castrated, throughout the rest of Scripture? So let's talk about eunuchs in the rest of the Bible. The word saris in the Hebrew Bible is usually what we see when we read about eunuchs. The complicated thing about the word saris is that it's used sometimes to mean people who are castrated, and it's used sometimes to mean like court official or chamberlain. And so if you are at all familiar with Game of Thrones, and there's a character in Game of Thrones who's the eunuch and is kind of like the schemy one, that's kind of one of the ways that eunuchs were understood within this ancient world context as well. The interesting thing about eunuchs is that they were sometimes seen as super untrustworthy, like the character in Game of Thrones, and sometimes they were seen as super trustworthy because essentially the idea was, well, if they don't have any family, like they can't have kids and therefore they can't pass on anything, so they can be entrusted with land and money and stuff because they have nobody to give it to when they die. That was sort of the general understanding. Eunuchs were also seen as people who could move between gendered spaces because they didn't pose any threat to men's masculinity and they didn't pose any threat to paternity status when they were with women. So it was really about men in both places, but so it goes. Such is history. But so you've essentially got this person who can move between gendered spaces and is not seen as particularly male, but is also not seen as female. They are essentially a third gender class or category within the ancient world. That's why some LGBTQ plus theologians look at eunuchs and they go, these people are important to understand, not because they're exactly like LGBT people today, but because they existed as a third gender category, and because they were a third gender, they were allowed to have different kinds of sexuality. So there's that separation again between gender and sexuality. But if you were a different gender, it was almost like the rules around sexuality didn't apply to you anymore. So that made it kind of more complex. So the next time that we see eunuchs after Deuteronomy 23:1, so an important thing happens here. Deuteronomy 23:1 is the law when Israel is living in Israel. They've got a kingdom, they've got a temple, everything is hunky-dory. But then Babylon and Syria come in and conquer the Israelite people and take them into slavery in Babylon and Persia, right? In Babylon and Persia, castration is super common. It's something that is just sort of like a matter of course. And so even though the Israelites were supposed to not let people be castrated, a bunch of people did get castrated while they were in slavery. So when the people of Israel come back from Babylon and they go and they start to try to rebuild Israel, they go back to all their laws and they're like, okay, what are we going to do to make this better the second time around? Like, we're rebuilding our entire society. Let's go back and look at our foundational rules and try to decide how we're going to do this. And they go back to Deuteronomy 23:1 and they go, okay, we've got this verse that says no castration, but now we have a bunch of eunuchs who are part of our community. Like, suddenly, you know, your sibling or your child or like people close to you are suddenly part of this category of people that are not supposed to be allowed in. And that's the moment where, like, folks today who are Christians in Christian community that aren't affirming read that and go, yeah, that's like what it's like for me. Like, I have a family member that isn't supposed to be allowed in because of the law. What do I do, right? So these ancient Israelites are asking the same question. And in that moment, we get a word from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 56 says, "Thus says the Lord, maintain justice and do what is right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance be revealed. Happy is the mortal who does this, the one who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and refrains from doing any evil. Do not let the foreigner join to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." That cut off bit is definitely a double entendre, by the way. That was intentional. The biblical writers love to do that. But this particular moment for the people of Israel is like revolutionary. Like, whoa, wait a minute. Are you saying that God has like changed God's mind about who's allowed in? Like, what's happening here? Is God changing? Are we changing? What's happening? We look at this now and we kind of go, God is responding to the reality of God's people, right? And saying, like, I know what I said before, but the situation has changed, and now we're doing something different. When the eunuch, where it says, do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree, the understanding there is that eunuchs are separated from God's covenant because they can't have kids. Because God's covenant was supposed to be like the covenant to Abraham, right? You're going to have so many kids, like the sand of the seashore and the stars of the sky, right? That was the covenant. So for the eunuchs who couldn't have kids, suddenly it was like, well, now I'm not part of the community of Israel. I'm not in the assembly of the Lord anymore. But God says, I'm going to give you something better than sons and daughters. I will give you a monument and a name, and it will be in my house and within my walls. So by saying that, it's like, okay, not only are you allowed in the community, but you're also allowed into the temple now. You can also worship now with the rest of the community. So that's a really powerful word about like being in the faith community of the time. Now here's the bad news. The bad news is Isaiah gets this word from God, but unfortunately, it was not the word that people wanted to hear. People read this and went, I don't know, because there were people that, there was a real sense of fear that if the community did something wrong or something against God's law, that God would allow them to be conquered again. So there was a lot of fear about like something bad might happen if we don't do the right thing. So in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you can read the other people that were writing at about the same time as Isaiah, who were essentially saying, no, we can't let more people in. We got to crack down. No foreigners, no eunuchs, no people that are doing anything wrong. Like, get everybody out of here. We've got to have the perfect community or we will be conquered again. So it was really out of that fear that people were moving. So the people that were on that boat, the Ezra and Nehemiah boat, were the ones that won the argument. So as it went on through the history of the Jewish people after this point, eunuchs were not allowed into the community of Israel. So that's where we are when we get to the Gospels, when we get to Jesus, right? And everybody always wants to know, what does Jesus say? Well, complicated, as usual with Jesus. In Matthew 19, we have Jesus' only words about eunuchs, but Jesus said to them, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and eunuchs who have, made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can." I love that Jesus bookends this with, "This is real confusing." What are you going to do? This passage has been understood in a couple of different ways. One way, because Jesus was just recently talking about divorce and marriage, some people have read this and said it's about celibacy. That's especially been true in the Catholic Church, where they've talked about like priests being celibate. They point to this verse and they go, celibacy is a choice that we are making for the sake of the kingdom of God. We're choosing not to get married, right? So that's been one way of understanding it, but celibacy was actually not the original way. For a long time, early Christians took this verse literally, and Origen of Alexandria, if you're familiar with him at all, he was like one of what we think of as like the church fathers. The story is that he actually did castrate himself on purpose because of this verse, because he was like, well, I'm going to take Jesus at his word, let's do it. So like, intense. So there was an understanding for a while that maybe Jesus literally meant eunuchs. And then at some point, Christian leaders were like, nobody's going to join our religion if we say this is real. This is not going to get people in the church. So there was a movement towards thinking about this as celibacy, right? So you could understand this as celibacy. It is a possible interpretation. However, the couple of things that make us think maybe Jesus was actually talking about eunuchs in his time and place is, one, Jesus would have known about, so here's the three categories that he gives us, right? Eunuchs who have been so from birth, eunuchs made eunuchs by others, and then this third weird category, eunuchs who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, right? Three categories. The first category, eunuchs who have been so from birth, Jesus would have known about intersex people, and we're going to talk more about what that means, but essentially means you are born with differences in sex development, which means that you might have reproductive organs that look either both male and female or sort of in the middle or neither one of those things. You have differences in sex development if you are intersex. We know Jesus would have known about intersex people, one, because they've always existed. We have them in like the historical and archaeological record. But two, because within the Talmud, which came around about 100 years after Jesus, after he would have died, this is the collection of Jewish law from around the same time, they recognized 4 different ways of being intersex, specifically. They recognize people that have both masculine and feminine characteristics, people that have like indeterminate physical characteristics where we're like, well, we just don't know, they're just different. And then we've got people who are assigned female at birth, but who develop masculine characteristics over time, which is actually something that we now understand is an intersex condition, but they didn't know that back then. And then the saris, who we just talked about, the person who has been castrated, or a person who is assigned male and then develops more female characteristics, which again can be a form of being intersex. So because the people from around Jesus' time knew that these people existed, we can understand that Jesus probably also knew that they existed, and that would be what he meant when he said people born eunuchs, right? People born with differences in sex development. The second category, people made eunuchs by others, those are just eunuchs. Everybody knew about them. They existed in that time and place. So really, all we're arguing about is that third category, eunuchs who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. That's the one that everybody argues about, because we just don't know. But regardless of whether Jesus meant literal eunuchs or not literal eunuchs or whoever he was talking about, we recognize 2 things. One, that throughout Jesus' whole ministry, he runs around healing everybody and restoring everybody to community, but he never heals a eunuch. He never heals a eunuch. And that might be that the eunuch would never, like a eunuch had never asked him and it was sort of a fluke, or it could be that there was an understanding that eunuchs did not need healing. So that's a possibility. The other thing that we have to look at here is the fact that Jesus took the identity of this eunuch, person outside of the gender and sexuality identities of the time, and said something about these people, like they get it. They're being made eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So he's elevating a marginalized identity and making it important and blessed. And that's something Jesus does all the time, right? He takes a lower identity and makes it a blessed identity. So regardless of who that is, we have to recognize that. The very last story we're going to look at is Acts chapter 8. So this is the beginning of the church, and I'm sorry that that text is so small. I will read the relevant parts.
The story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts. The Ethiopian eunuch is one of the first 2 converts to Christianity within the Christian church, so a really important person for us as the church today. The Ethiopian eunuch was somebody who was from Ethiopia. He had traveled to Jerusalem to pray in the temple, and he is on his way back to Ethiopia in his chariot when he meets Philip. The Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south to the road that goes from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road," in parentheses. So he got up and went. There was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to the chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And he replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. And so then we get this passage that Philip is reading, or that the eunuch is reading from Isaiah. "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. His humiliation was denied. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" So, I want to stop there for a second.
There's a lot going on here. Things to recognize. Number 1, the Ethiopian eunuch. When I talk about him as the most identity-rich person in the Bible because he's Ethiopian, so he's not of the ethnic and racial identity of the Hebrew people. He is not necessarily Jewish and not necessarily a Gentile because he's reading the Jewish scriptures, but we have no sense of him as a Jewish person or a Jewish convert, so he's like in a weird middle space in terms of religion. He is a slave or a servant, but he is one of the head servants of the queen, so he's in a weird socioeconomic space as well, right? And he's a eunuch, so he's in a weird gender and sexuality space as well. He is in the middle of all of these identities, right? And so he's reading, and he's coming back from Jerusalem, and you can kind of imagine this. He would have gone to Jerusalem to pray in the temple, and he would not have been allowed in because those rules were never changed, right? So imagine you go all the way from Ethiopia all the way to Jerusalem, and you get there, and they're like, "Nope, sorry, you can't come in." And he's like, "But it says right here in Isaiah," and they're like, "No, it doesn't matter. You can't come in." That's what he would have been dealing with, and he's on his way home now. And he meets Philip. And so he's reading this passage, and he reads this section here. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? And can you imagine reading that as somebody who just essentially had justice denied to you, right? As somebody who just went and tried to get close to God and got rejected by the people around and maybe by God, like you don't know, you're in this position. So he's reading this text, and he says, who does the prophet say this about? About himself or about someone else? Because you can imagine that if the eunuch is reading this and going, "Oh, I relate to this, I get this," he wants to know who this is about because he wants to know who it is that understands him so well, right? And so Philip begins to speak, starting with the scripture. He proclaims to him the good news about Jesus. As they're going along the road, they came to the water, and the eunuch said, "Here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. So, a couple things about this. Number 1, the question that the eunuch asks, "What is to prevent me?" is not a rhetorical question. He's really asking, which part of all these weird marginal identities that I have is going to be the one that's a problem for you, Philip? Like, take your pick. It could be any of these. So the fact that he says, "What is to prevent me?" and then Philip doesn't even answer, he just does the thing, right? And then at the end here, one of the things that biblical writers like to do is to make people do physical things that reflects what's going on with them internally. So a lot of times if somebody is coming and repenting for something, then at the end of the story you'll get a thing about how they turned around because they're doing a physical thing to reflect what's going on internally for them. With the eunuch, he gets baptized. The eunuch saw him no more, went on his way rejoicing. Continues doing exactly what he was doing. Nothing about him changed. He didn't change anything. He was the same person. He was accepted in his entirety. And that's the story of one of the first 2 people to join the church. So, what does that mean for us, right? What does that mean for us and how we do church now? So, that's where I'm going to leave us. We're going to take a break to just let all that sort of sink in. chill out for a little while. Why don't we come back here? It's going to be maybe a little bit of a short break, but why don't we come back here at 1:50? That gives us a little over 10 minutes. I was just up, I was a guest faculty member at a camp/retreat center over the summer, and whenever I had to get people back together again after they were all talking, I had to do the like Sunday school clap thing. Yeah, so I've now started doing integrating the Sunday school clap. Well, thank you for coming back. Thank you for not running out the door. It's always hard when I do trainings like this to try to decide whether we should talk about modern identities before the Bible stuff or after the Bible stuff, because you probably noticed I referenced a lot of things like intersex people without really explaining what that meant. And part of why I did the Bible stuff first today is because I thought maybe it would be more helpful in terms of not running with the anachronisms and putting modern ideas on biblical stuff if we did the biblical stuff first. But in case there were things that I mentioned that you were like, I've never heard of that, that's why we're doing this second session. So we're going to be talking about what all these letters mean and what do we do in our congregations and in our communities to make them more open, welcoming, affirming to our LGBTQ plus siblings. So let's start there. Let's start with what all these letters mean. I know a lot of you are like, what is this ridiculous alphabet soup? We're going to start out, here's how we're going to frame this. We're going to start out with like a big bird's eye view, and we're just going to get closer and closer and closer and closer. So if at some point along the way you're like, I'm overloaded, at least you'll have gotten to that point, and that's great, right? So let's start out with those two big categories that I introduced before. We've got sexual orientation, and we've got gender, right? So those are your two big bird's eye view boxes that we're going to start out with. So your orientation, also known as your sexuality, I use those two things kind of interchangeably. We've talked about sexuality or sexual orientation for such a long time that that's the sort of word or phrasing that people are most used to these days. But there's sort of a move toward trying to get people to talk about orientation instead, because when we talk about things like sexuality, we're not always talking about sex and the people that other people want to have sex with, because there's a portion of our community that we'll talk about who are asexual, who don't want to have sex with anybody, and it's about romantic orientation and emotional connection with people. So that's why we've kind of moved toward talking about orientation rather than sexuality or sexual orientation. So that's why I use those things interchangeably. So again, your orientation is something that nobody else can see, right? But what they can see is your sexual behavior, and they may also see things like your relationship style. So that might include, like, if you are a monogamous person and you're only in a relationship with one other person, you might be a polyamorous person who wants to be in a relationship with several people at the same time. You might be a celibate person who doesn't want to be in a relationship at all, right? So there's relationship style sort of on top of behavior there that you can see. So there's your first box. Your second box, which we talked about before, is gender. Your gender, again, is made up of three different parts: your body, your gender identity, and your gender expression. The other phrase that you might see around body, which I used before, is assigned sex. So everybody's got an assigned sex that you get usually at this point before you're born when they do an ultrasound. And your assigned sex is 99% of the time based on a visual examination of your external reproductive organs. And like I said before, that's a small part of the sort of assigned sexness of your body. So it's kind of like, you know, looking outside through a peephole and being like, I think it's raining. Is it sunny? I can't really tell. And then you go outside and you're like, oh, okay. So like if you're just looking at external reproductive organs, you're looking at a very small bit of somebody. So most people are either assigned male or female at birth, but part of our population is assigned intersex right at birth. We think the population of intersex folks is about 1.7% of the population, which you would think like, well, that's kind of small, until you put it in context and you're like, well, 1 out of 100 births, okay, that's something. And then when you think about the fact that that's about the same percentage of our population that has naturally red hair, that has the genes for red hair, so like that's actually more people than you would normally think, right? So it's a larger population that kind of gets ignored. And actually, the population of intersex people that we know about right now is actually larger than the population of transgender people that we know about right now. But you never hear about intersex people, and you hear about trans folks all over the place right now. So just goes to show you that visibility does not always reference the actual reality. The other thing about intersex folks is that intersex folks don't always know that they're intersex because your external reproductive organs are affected by so many different things, and because we're only looking at that thing, lots of intersex folks maybe have external reproductive organs that look very stereotypically male or female, but they may have different internal reproductive organs and different chromosomes, and if there's no medical problem, a lot of folks don't know about it. So lots of intersex folks don't actually know they're intersex until puberty, where suddenly it's like they've been assigned female and they've grown up thinking they were a girl their whole life, and then they don't get their period, and somebody's like, well, this is weird, and they go to the doctor and find out, well, they don't actually have a uterus. So there's a lot of things that could affect being intersex and not knowing. Most people don't have their genes karyotyped, meaning they don't know, like we all assume men have XY chromosomes and women have XX chromosomes. Turns out there's a percentage of our population that has a variation of those things, but if your genes don't get turned on by certain hormone factors, you would never know it. So there are different combinations like XYY, YXX, XXX. There's a singular Y at some points, and some of these genetic differences will cause physical differences that are noticeable and like sometimes need medical attention. And other times it's like they call it like junk DNA, right? A lot of times they're just not turned on, and so we don't know. So even our expectations about like men have XY and women have XX are not always true. So intersex folks kind of complicate the narrative for us in a good way. So now that we've got these two boxes, we've got your orientation and we've got gender, I've got your two circles here, and I want you all to help me out here with these identities about which goes in which circle. So I'm going to give you one, and you're going to tell me which circle it is. So the first one in our acronym is for L for lesbian. Where does lesbian go? Yes. Okay, how about gay? How about bisexual? How about transgender? That one's easy. How about queer? Both is what I heard, and that is correct. Let's talk about the word queer for a second. The word queer is one of those ones that for some people feels like you got punched in the gut, and for other people it's like, this is the coolest word I've ever heard, I love it. Because we have to recognize that that is true in our community, we have to be very careful about how we use this word. The rule of thumb that I always give is if somebody introduces themselves in a context like this where we're talking about identity and they say, I identify as queer, use that for them. That's the word that they use for themselves. However, I would never use the word queer for somebody else without knowing that that was what they used for themselves, because you just don't want to assume. You just don't want to assume. The other part of this that complicates things is that there are certain academic fields where the word queer is just in it. For instance, queer theology and queer studies in some cases. Those are situations where the word queer is like in the title of what the academic thing is actually called. So there are times where it would make sense to use it in that context. And you could be a straight cisgender person, meaning not transgender, and talk about how Vanderbilt has a queer studies program, and it would be okay to say that because that's what it's called. But I would never go to somebody and be like, this is my queer friend so-and-so, if I didn't know that was how they actually identified. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So that's the word queer. And we put queer here in sort of in the in-between of orientation and gender, because one of the strengths of the word queer is that it is something that everybody can use without having to say the big long acronym, without having to remember the letters. So you could just say queer, and that kind of covers everybody. Now, the one complication with that is that's not always the case. For instance, in some Black and Latinx, Latinx, we put an X there sometimes so that it's not a gendered word for folks that are Latino or Hispanic. In those communities, sometimes the word queer only does mean the orientation part of things, and so they'll say queer and transgender to kind of cover everybody. So there's a bit of a cultural thing here too. If you are in a community that is different from the one that you are normally in, you might kind of wait to see how other people are using the word before you start using it. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so we've got lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender, and I'm going to talk lots more about trans because that's what I am, so I'll explain more about that later. How about the word intersex? Yes, that's on the gender side because it's about your gender and your assigned sex and not who you're attracted to. How about pansexual? Yep, that's got sexual in it, so it's an automatic hint. How about two-spirit? Both. I heard over there on the side. Two-spirit is a category for Native American folks and First Nations folks in Canada. Two-spirit is a word that actually, or a phrase, a label, that that came about in the 90s. They had a congregation of Native American and First Nations folks up in, I think it was in Ontario, where they got a bunch of Native folks who identify as LGBT together, and they said, we all have words for what we are in our own individual tribal languages, but we want a word or a phrase that can work for all of us regardless of our native language, and they picked two-spirit. So that's where two-spirit came from in the 90s. And the idea there is that like within Ojibwe and Navajo and Cree and a couple of other like pretty large tribes in North America, there is an understanding of people outside of gender and orientation in the Western world that's just part of their culture and has always been. It's usually related to, it's usually not something that you just take on and say, this is what I am. Usually it's something that's confirmed by the elders in your particular tribe. It's usually a communal type thing. You're known as a two-spirit person, and that has a certain value and has certain obligations that go along with it. So that's what two-spirit is. It's specific to Native folks. So if you're not Native, not your thing. How about asexual? Orientation. Those sexual ones are always so easy. You can just put them right over there. So asexual folks are folks who may not have a sexual attraction to anybody. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have an emotional attraction or a romantic attraction. They may still be in relationships, but they don't necessarily feel sexual attraction. Or they may feel it at a different sort of amount or rate than other people. So for instance, I have a friend who identifies as asexual, but they will start to feel sort of sexual attraction towards somebody after they like really get to know them like really well and have been in a relationship for a long time, and that's at the point where they kind of go, okay, now I'm starting to feel sexual attraction towards somebody. Asexual folks have been kind of medicalized in very specific ways to be like, oh, something's wrong with you. You don't have a sex drive. You don't want to have sex with everybody. Something's wrong. And then we try to like fix them, right? It's just a different orientation. It's a normal human variation. It's not something that needs to be fixed. If you are somebody who doesn't have a sex drive or has a lower sex drive or that bothers you, then okay, yes, go to your doctor. You're maybe not asexual. Maybe it's like a weird side effect from something else. But for asexual folks, that's just part of who they are and it doesn't bother them, and that's fine. So asexual folks are part of the orientation side of our big circles here. So are there any quick questions about these circles or the identities in them really quickly before we go on? Okay, cool. So how do we refer to this big group of people? We might refer to them, this is the longest acronym currently in common use. There's actually longer ones, but this is the longest one currently in modern use. LGBTQIP2A. So those are all the ones that we just talked about there. The 2 is for two-spirit. LGBTQIP2A. So that's kind of one of the ones that you might look at. Sometimes people just say LGBT for short, or LGBTQ+, because we're always adding on. I once had somebody ask me, when will we stop adding letters? I'm so tired of adding letters. Like, when are we just going to be done? And I'm like, well, probably never. Like, the idea is drawing the circle wider here to encompass more and more people who have a different orientation or gender. That's what all this stuff is under. One of the easiest ways to refer to this big community that I use is people of different sexualities and genders, or people of different orientations and genders. That way you don't have to remember the letters. If you can't remember what order they go in, or you're unsure about them, people of different orientations or sexualities and genders is a big way. So let's talk about trans folks, because I'm trans, so that's what you're going to hear a lot about from me, because I feel like I can speak out of my own experience there in a different way. What should I say about myself before we go into this? I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as male, and I use he, him, his pronouns. So that's a little bit about me and my experience of gender. I transitioned starting in about 2014. It was right. They handed me my diploma from seminary, and I said, thank you. Surprise! Wasn't totally sure how they were going to handle me being trans at this particular seminary that I went to. Turns out it was fine after the fact, but I would have been the first person, and I wasn't ready to risk all of that debt. So I waited till afterwards. But they've been great about it. So, I started transitioning in 2014, came out in 2014. So that's a little bit about my existence as a trans person. And I identify as a trans man. So what does all this stuff mean? Trans is an umbrella term. So much like we have, like I said, we were going to do this zooming in, right? So you've got orientation and you've got gender. And then under gender, you've got trans. And now I'm going to do an umbrella under trans, right? We're zooming in further on that side. Trans is an umbrella word. The opposite of transgender is the word cisgender. Trans and cis are both Latin prefixes. Cis means all on the same side, and trans means moving across. So those are your two things. Cis, all on the same side, trans across. Cisgender being your assigned sex and your gender identity are on the same side, on the same line, right? Cisgender or transgender, they're on kind of opposite shores and you're transitioning, right? So that's the difference between trans and cis. Identities that fall under trans include trans men like me who are assigned female at birth but know themselves to be male. You've got trans women who are assigned male at birth but know themselves to be female. And if you're ever like, is this a trans man or a trans woman? Like I can't remember like which one I'm supposed to use. It's the identity that the person currently has. So not what they were born as, not how they were assigned, but what they currently are. And then there are non-binary folks. The gender binary is this idea that everybody has to fit into either male box or female box. That's all you get, 1 or 0. That's the binary, right? So people who are non-binary identify as outside of that 2-box system. So they might identify or know themselves to be sort of a mix of male and female, or they might feel like they are kind of outside of that altogether. There's something different. So my friend M, who's non-binary, talks about how they're non-binary, and they said, it's like you've got this like 2D thing where you're asking me to like check a box, A box or B box, but it's not a 2-dimensional thing, it's a 3-dimensional thing, and I'm over here. And I'm like, oh, okay. So not so much like a line, but like a constellation, right, in 3D. So that's really, non-binary people will explain how they feel differently, but that's a little bit of background. We also have agender people who are kind of like asexual people. They just don't experience their sense of gender, or they experience it in like a different sort of rate or amount than other folks. Gender fluid people experience their gender as something that kind of changes over time. And gender queer folks, gender queer is an interesting one because some people use it, like the word queer in general, to just mean like, I'm outside the box, like I'm gender queer, I'm all of these things, right? And there's like a good flexibility that comes with the word. Other people use gender queer specifically because they want to really lean into the idea of like disrupting the gender binary. Like they are intentional about the fact that I'm frustrated with this stupid way that things are categorized as male and female, and I want to mess with it a little bit. So there's kind of, some people are just like, this explains the flexibility I have, and other people are like, this explains why things need to change and why I want to be part of that change. So you might feel one way or the other or both. Gender expansive and gender nonconforming are kind of different ways to just explain that you maybe totally identify with the gender you were assigned at birth, but you just express that a little bit differently. So it's been really helpful for parents who have gender expansive or gender nonconforming kids to say like, well, my kid's 4, like they don't really identify as much of anything, they're still learning who they are a little bit, but they were assigned female at birth, but they really like to wear like boys' clothes and play with toys we associate with boys, and so they're gender expansive, right? So that's just another way of like naming the sort of bigness of something without having to pigeonhole it right away. So that's where that comes from. So a trans person, transgender, is an adjective, right? So you would never say a transgender, because that's not how the language works. You would say a transgender person. So it's a little bit like you wouldn't say somebody, you also wouldn't say somebody is Asian Americaned with an ED on the end. You'd say they're Asian American, right? Because it's a descriptive word about them. So you don't have to add like the A in front of it, you don't have to add the ED on the end of it. Especially because the ED makes it seem like something happened to you. Like, what happened to you that you got transgendered? You also don't need the ED on the end of cisgender. You're just cisgender, not cisgendered at the end. Does that make sense? Cool. You look like you had a hand, but I think you're just thinking. Okay, cool. There's recent movement, and this maybe is going to sound, and maybe more of this than just what I'm about to say, but some of this might sound like being overly picky to you about language. Like, why do we have to be so specific or picky about this? The reality is, because when we use the language that people use for themselves, we're showing them that we respect and see them as who they are. We're not trying to put our own understandings on somebody else. We're trying to say, I see that you use that language for yourself, and I respect you enough to pay attention to that and to use it for you. So this instance here, where there's some recent movements from trans man and trans woman as all one word to separate words, trans man, trans woman. The reason we're doing that is because if you do like the combination thing where it's trans man or trans woman, it's almost like saying you're a different, like, I don't know, like a different kind of something. It's putting kind of a weird stipulation on like, you're not quite really a woman, you're a trans woman, right? So we've kind of moved to making those two separate words, especially because it makes more sense as a descriptive word as an adjective. So we've started saying trans man, trans woman. Some trans folks don't even want to use the trans bit. They're just like, well, I'm a man or I'm a woman, and that's fine. You don't have to, nobody is owed that background of what you were assigned at birth. The only context in which that might be something that is a really good idea to talk about is if you're in a doctor's office and they have to know about your reproductive organs. Otherwise, it's nobody's business. So sometimes you want to use trans man, sometimes you just want to use man. Either one is fine. Some terms that we don't use anymore. Transsexual is one that is not really used anymore. Sometimes older trans folks will still use it to specifically specify. It used to sort of demarcate this difference. If you were transgender, that didn't necessarily say anything about if you transitioned or had surgery, whereas transsexual was specifically like if you've transitioned and had surgery, that was something that you used. So some older folks will still use it, but mostly people don't use transsexual anymore. So we've kind of moved to the transgender side of things. People used to talk about getting a sex change. We don't really talk about that anymore. We would talk about gender confirmation surgery as a way of saying it. Gender affirmation surgery is a way of saying it. You could say gender surgery and not be wrong if you were just like, I don't know what to call this, but we don't use sex change anymore. And then hermaphrodite was an older word that we used to talk about intersex folks. So if you're like, oh, I know what hermaphrodite is and I don't know what intersex is, it's the same thing. It's just hermaphrodite came from a Greek myth that was not especially helpful. So we've moved to intersex as the way to explain that group of folks. So there's some words to use and not use. Let's talk a little bit more about what transition looks like. There's a lot of fear around transition and like how that happens, and especially with youth, everybody's like really concerned about what's going on with the kids and why are there so many more trans folks? Is it in the water? Like, there's a lot of fear going on. So let's talk about how this works. Lots of trans folks experience something called gender dysphoria. Not everybody experiences gender dysphoria, but clinically, this is kind of like people go, officially, if you're a psychologist, you can say, yes, you're transgender because you have gender dysphoria. So that's kind of what psychologists or psychiatrists would be looking for. Dysphoria is the conflict between the gender everybody keeps telling you you are and the gender you know yourself to be. It's this conflict between your assigned sex and your gender identity. And that conflict, it's a sense of, it's like dissonance. It's a dissonance between those two things that can cause distress. So when there's a dissonance like that that causes distress between your assigned sex and the gender you know yourself to be, that's gender dysphoria. Unfortunately, we have to talk again about conversion therapy and reparative therapy because it's become a thing that people are, again, thinking will work. Conversion therapy and reparative therapy do not work for sexuality or for gender. Neither one of them works. We have studies to show the fact that it does not work. Lots of people will say, like, well, wouldn't it be easier if you've got this dissonance between these two things to just make your gender identity match the body that you have? Like, wouldn't that be easier? Well, If it worked, maybe it would be, but it doesn't work. The only thing that is proven to alleviate gender dysphoria is allowing somebody to transition in whatever way makes sense for them, to bring their understanding of themselves and the way that they express their gender to match who they know themselves to be. The brain is a very complicated thing, and we can't change people's brains to think that they're something that they're not. That's just the way the world works. So there are a couple different ways to transition. There's social transition, there's medical transition, and there's legal transition. Social transition is changing things like your name or your pronouns, which we'll talk a little bit more about, or your clothing or your haircut. That's all social transition. Medical transition is changing things about your body by either going through hormone therapy or having some kind of gender confirmation surgery. Not everybody chooses to medically transition. You can be 100% trans and just socially transition in the ways that you want. Nobody has to have any medical things done to them. Not a requirement at all. The last one, legal transition, is all about changing the gender markers on like your passport and your driver's license and your birth certificate and all that kind of stuff. So those are different ways that people might choose to transition. Nothing is required of any trans person. The idea is that you are just bringing things into alignment with who you know yourself to be, and that's going to look different for every person. So then this last point here is the complicated part, right? Being transgender is not a mental illness. Having a gender identity that's different from your assigned sex is not a mental illness, but because people might want to medically transition, there is a requirement to have a diagnosis from a medical professional in order to medically transition. So there's this complicated thing where psychologists and psychiatrists are like, we know that this is not a mental disorder, but we have to code it somehow so that you can get hormone therapy and be able to transition. So that's why we have this diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So they're not saying who you are is wrong, they're saying you have this symptom that can be alleviated. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's kind of why this is complicated. It's why we could take being gay out of the DSM, the diagnostic manual, because gay folks didn't need any medical help being themselves, right? So that was easy. We could just take that right out. But because trans folks may want to medically transition, we need a code for that, essentially. It's kind of like insurance. You have to have a code for it. So that's why we have gender dysphoria as a code. Let's talk about trans youth for a second. Trans youth, we know through our understanding of developmental psychology that there are 3 points in life where a person might start to understand that they're trans. These are 3 points where gender kind of comes to the forefront of our self-understanding. The first one is ages 2 to 3, because that's the first time you're like, hey, I'm a person. So you get to sort of understand a little bit more about yourself around that age. So some trans folks will say, oh yeah, like I can remember, like I was 3 and I remember putting up a fit about having to wear dresses. Like there are very specific gender memories around that time. The next time is age like 10 to 14-ish. It's like right when puberty is starting. And if you've ever been in a body and puberty is starting and you're like, this is the wrong puberty, you will know how stressful that is. You got me the wrong one, Mom. The next time is weird because it only really shows up in contexts where we have this weird extended adolescence of college and university. But like ages 18 to 22 is the third big time when people are like, hey, I'm figuring this out, because it's the first time they get to go be an adult by themselves. And so it's funny because that third one doesn't exist in societies where we don't have this sort of early adult stage of understanding, but it exists for us. So those are the 3 points at which people are most likely to figure out that they're trans. However, you can figure out that you're trans at age 3 and not come out till age 40, and that doesn't make you any less trans. Like, those are the periods of like self-understanding that tend to be common. A lot of times parents are like, is my kid trans? Like, I don't know what's going on here, because their kid really likes or really dislikes certain things around like gender expression. And so parents kind of get a little bit nervous. The thing that psychologists and psychiatrists and developmental experts are saying about kids and gender is that if kids are insistent, consistent, and persistent about gender stuff, that's when you start to take it seriously. Because kids are kids, and they like to play with gender. And if you come home and you find your kid who's assigned male at birth smeared in makeup, sometimes they're just playing with makeup because it's face paint and it's fun. And there's no reason they shouldn't, right? Like, being gender creative is great, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything about their gender identity. It's just when you, like, consistently, this has been a thing for a really long time, they are persistent about it, that my kid refuses to put on a dress and puts up a fight every time, and it's been happening for months and years at this point, and they're insisting to me that they're not really a girl, they're really a boy, and like, that's when you're like, okay, now this is something that we should go see somebody about, who can help us understand more about what's going on. So we want to be like aware enough to be able to help our kids when they actually are presenting with things that we're like, oh, maybe this is something to pay attention to. But we also don't want to like punish our kids and like give them a label too early when they're just being creative with their gender, and that's fine too. Because a lot of our gender roles are dumb. It's dumb that boys can't wear dresses. They should be able to do that. The last point here is there's all of this fear around little kids transitioning and like, oh my gosh, they're doing surgery on little kids. Nobody's doing surgery on little kids. It's not a thing that's happening. The way that our medical system is set up right now, it is nigh impossible to start any kind of medical transition before age 16. Like, even at 16, between 16 and 18, you have to get in almost every state, you have to get both of your parents' signed signatures. So like if your parents disagree with each other, you're SOL. It's incredibly difficult, even at age 16, to medically transition. And nothing is happening before that, with the exception of there's something called hormone blockers. Hormone blockers are this really interesting thing that you can give kids starting right at the beginning of puberty, and it essentially blocks the puberty hormones from starting anything going on with their bodies. And it gives you more time, essentially. It's like hitting a press pause button on puberty for kids. And the minute you stop taking those hormone blockers, it kicks right back in again. They're completely reversible. So the thing here is for folks who have a kid that's maybe 12 and is just coming out as trans, and they're like really freaked out about puberty and what it's going to do to their body, because a lot of parts of puberty are irreversible. They will go on hormone blockers with both of their parents' consent, or guardians or whoever. They can go on hormone blockers for a period of time to give them more time to figure out what's going on. And so that's been a really, really great thing for a lot of kids. But again, that's reversible, which is why they allow it in people under age 16. So that's what's going on with transition in kids, so you don't have to be freaked out. So is there any other questions that you might have about trans folks before we go on from this section? The most recent thing that's happened in just like the last month and a half, there's a new push from a church called Bethel in Redding, California. Bethel has a really big music ministry, and a lot of people use their music. And they recently started this thing called the Changed program, and it's essentially just like, here are all these people whose sexuality and gender has been changed. Mostly sexuality. They're not talking as much about gender. But there's a resurgence of this idea that conversion therapy works. And so, yeah, it's not great, because people kind of thought, like, we've maybe made it past this. Turns out we haven't. So we want to be really clear about that. I had one hand over here and then over there.
Does insurance pay for the procedures
So the question was, does insurance pay for any sort of medical transition? And the answer to that is different depending on what kind of insurance you have, basically. The Affordable Care Act changed things so that you can't be denied certain things for being transgender, but you also don't necessarily have to have things approved. It's a really complex thing. For instance, when I wanted to have top surgery, which is like chest reconstruction surgery, I had to petition my insurance to allow for top surgery, and I got a letter back that was like, okay, we've approved you if you can find somebody in network. Turns out there's nobody in network that does top surgery. So like, even if you theoretically get things covered, because there are complications within the medical side of the system, and the medical system and the insurance system don't talk to each other, it can be really complicated. So a lot of trans folks end up having to pay all of their surgery and hormone therapy costs out of pocket. There's one over here.
Did I hear you say SOL?
Oh. I'm sorry, I should have been more specific. That's not an acronym that you have to know. I was inserting a bad word. Somebody explain what the bad word was. My apologies. I shouldn't use, acronyms like that when I'm talking about acronyms like this. That's a really good point. Any other quick questions about trans stuff before we go on? All right, good. So now that you've got a little bit of a background on what this community looks like, let's talk about what we can actually do and why it's important. The first thing is we have to talk about why this is important. And like the reparative therapy thing, this is something where it's like, it sucks that we have to talk about this, but we have to talk about this so that we know what's going on. The first thing that we have to know are the suicide and violence rates for the LGBTQ+ community, because they're ridiculous. There was an 86% increase in homicides of LGBTQ+ people in 2017. 2017 is the most recent date that we have information for through the FBI's hate crime program. So we haven't heard for 2018 how much it went up, if any, but an 86% jump from 2016 to 2017 is big. It's big and not great. So far this year, 18 trans folks have been murdered in the US. The highest number was in 2017, which is when that first number was from. We had 26 trans people murdered in 2017. Almost all of the trans folks that are murdered are trans women of color. Black trans women and Latino and Latinx trans women are at the highest risk for violence. The second highest group is actually gay men, and black gay men specifically are at the highest risk for violence right now. So keeping in mind the fact that this is like an everyday thing that people live with, the fact that people are concerned about walking down the street and going to get food and seeing their partner, and like, this is big stuff. So we have to be aware of that. We also have to be aware of the suicide statistics. 18 to 28% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people attempt suicide, and 41% of transgender people attempt suicide, so almost half. And that's, it's big. It's big, and it's something that the percentage points and the numbers do not accurately define or give you a sense of. To give you a better sense, it's just like that, the constant sense of your friends are dying all the time, whether because they are being killed or because they are killing themselves, and that is the reality that you live with. That's what it feels like. So being aware of that, being aware of the fact that LGBTQ+ people who experience family rejection are twice as likely to attempt suicide, and religion is cited as the largest factor in family rejection. So when we have this very direct correlation where if you are in a affirming, let's look at it in the positive way. If you are in an affirming religious community, it is more likely that the family that is in that community will be affirming, and then it is more likely that they will affirm their child, which means their risk of not only self-harm, but also drug addiction and risky sexual behavior plummets, goes way down. So if we can create affirming faith communities, we create affirming families, we create healthy youth. It's like a bam, 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 all the way down. And so one of the fastest ways to fight these statistics is to have affirming faith communities. One of the questions that I often get asked is, if being LGBTQ is not a mental disorder, why are the suicide rates so high? Which is like kind of a hard question to answer because it assumes a lot of things. But the reality is that the suicide rate is high because we have this thing called minority stress. Minority stress affects anybody who is in a social minority. It will affect you at different levels. If you are familiar with the sociological understanding of intersectionality, that's kind of what's going on here. You have layers of pressure depending on the identities that you hold. So within LGBT communities, we deal with the fact, like the easiest way to explain minority stress is by saying you're living in a world that wasn't built for you. So if you are a trans person and you are living in a world that's not built for you, that looks like going to school and not having a bathroom that you can use safely. That is going to cause you some psychological stress as well as physical problems later on. Like it's stressful to live in a situation where you have to be concerned about your safety all the time. We know that these sort of compounding issues of safety make things worse. So we've got this study from the University of Minnesota of Native folks, Native men specifically, found that 47.3% of gay youth had considered suicide in Native LGBT communities versus 23% of their straight peers. So you've got like this layering on depending on your race and ethnicity, depending on your socioeconomic class. Like all of these things will pile on. If you are LGBT, then plus all these other things, like that's just going to make it worse. So we have to be aware of the fact that this is not sort of a one and done type of fix. But these are what's going into that high suicide rate. So lack of things or things that can cause or exacerbate minority stress. Lack of access to institutions and resources, experiencing harassment, being subjected to stereotypes and being expected to fit into those stereotypes. Actually, let me say one thing about that stereotype thing. So within my community, with the trans folks that I work with, here's an example of how this works. I work with a lot of trans youth, and there's this happens all the time where I'll be talking with one of them and they'll want to talk to me about the doubts that they have about their gender and the experiences that they've had where they're like, I don't know, am I really trans? Do I really feel this way? How, like, they're going through stuff and they want to talk about how they're experiencing it, but they feel that they can't talk about any doubts that they have because everybody around them expects them to be 100% certain or they won't be taken seriously. So they can't talk to doctors about how they feel because if the doctor's like, oh, are you not sure? Because then we're not gonna like help you with what you need. Like there's this expectation that you have to be 100% certain all the time, which forces these youth into like doing things that they're not maybe ready to do because they haven't had a space to talk about their doubts and their feelings and their experiences. So that's an expectation of a stereotype that all trans people are like 100% on board and know their gender all the time that is actually harmful in the realistic day-to-day life. So that's just one example of what that looks like. This last one here is the one that there was a study that was done that pointed to this last point where it says a lack of hope for these conditions to change in the future. That's the point where faith communities can actually do the most good because we have a kind of hope and understanding that we can offer people that they may not have outside of a faith context, depending on what society looks like at the time. So that's the point at which faith communities can maybe do the most good. This is a statistic here that is important for us to think about when we think about why it's important for our churches to be specific about our welcome. There was a study done from the Human Rights Campaign with LGBT youth asking whether their church was affirming or not. 8% said their church was very accepting, 22% said their church was not at all accepting, 53% say they did not know whether their church was accepting or not. Now the problem with that is that because of minority stress, if you don't know for sure if somebody is accepting or if a space is accepting, you have to assume that it isn't for your own safety. So this 53% of kids might as well said, my church is not affirming, because they didn't know because their church wasn't talking about it. They had to assume that it isn't. I had the same thing happen when I was growing up in the ELCA church I was in as a 17 and 18-year-old, and the church said nothing about LGBTQ stuff, and therefore I had to assume that it wasn't safe for me to come out there, even though in my early 20s I did come out and it was fine. But because they never said anything, I spent all that time not being able to talk to people about it. So it's really important that we are specific about what we're thinking, and even if we're not specific and we haven't come to like a consensus, the fact that we are having conversations about it is enough to allow our youth to start having conversations about it as well. So like I said, we've got this very specific, like all the way through through line of affirming faith communities to affirming families to affirmed youth and healthy youth. Over half of the LGBTQ plus young people who were rejected by their families reported having attempted suicide, compared to only 32% of those who had supportive families. So you're bringing it down by about 20%. Family acceptance is also a protection against depression, substance abuse, and other negative mental health issues usually seen in those who experience minority stress.